Welcome to the next episode of Brandland. I'm your host, Garrett Justice, and I'm joined by a very special guest today, Scott Miller, who's the Executive Vice President of Thought Leadership at Franklin Covey. Scott, how are you doing today?
Garrett, I'm great. Thank you for the invitation and the platform today.
Yeah, no problem. It's great to have you on the show and really excited to dive into our topic today that really revolves around some of the great content you've put out there in your books. And so excited to talk about that. But before we do, why don't you give our listeners a little bit more of an overview of your background, your career so far, and a little bit more about Franklin Covey?
Sure. So like you, I live here in Utah. I've been married for 11 years. We have 3 boys that are 6, 8, and 10. I don't recommend that to anybody because that was a formula for disaster on many fronts. They're healthy, but they're driving me insane. I'm actually from Florida originally, born and raised in Central Florida. Spent my first 26 years there, worked for the Disney company, the Disney Development Company. They invited me to leave back in 96, which is a nice way of saying get out. That's how Disney fires people.
Been there,
and
done
so
that.
Here I am, 26, and I moved to Provo, Utah. And so I was a single Catholic boy from Orlando moving to Provo, Utah. That's like being Jewish and moving to Vatican City, right?
Yeah.
A massive cultural change. Joined the Franklin Covey Company, which of course is the world's largest, I think most prestigious leadership development brand. Been the firm for now just shy of 25 years, spent 15 years in the sales side, sales leadership side. Spent 8 years as the chief marketing officer, the company's only ever chief marketing officer. About 2 years ago, stepped away from that role and became the executive vice president of thought leadership, where now I lead our thought leadership strategy for the world. I've authored and published 2 best-selling books. I have 2 more coming out this year. I'm privileged to host what is Franklin Covey's podcast, which is now the world's largest subscribed to leadership podcast in the world, called On Leadership with Scott Miller. I write a weekly column for Inc. magazine, write a blog, just trying to keep it going in the midst of a pandemic. So I'm honored to be on your podcast today.
Yeah, I love it. Just do a little bit of everything, it sounds like, Scott. So really excited to have you on the show and just dive into that wealth of experience and knowledge that you have. You know, before we jump in though, too, I'm curious, having worked at Franklin Covey for over 2 decades, what was that experience like to rub shoulders with Stephen Covey, you know, in the time that he was still there before he passed? What's an impactful lesson or story that you could share about him?
Well, for those who don't know, Dr. Covey passed just shy of 10 years ago as a result of a head injury from a bicycle accident. He was wearing a helmet, but not tight enough. And the man was impeccably focused on his character, right? And on being congruent with what he taught. Of course, he authored the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's in its 30th year, sold 40 million copies. What I learned most from Dr. Covey was the difference between Garrett having an efficient mindset and having an effective mindset. He wrote the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's often mistermed by journalists, The 7 Habits of Highly Efficient People. No, there's a difference between being efficient and being effective. Is that a lot of us have achieved professional success by being very productive, by being very efficient, working well in crises, right? Checking things off, getting things done. And that's fine in certain areas of your life. But when it comes to the most important area of your life, whether you're a leader in a company or a parent or a boyfriend or a spouse or a son-in-law, a neighbor, a church committee member, those are your relationships. And you cannot be efficient with people. You must be effective. And that you generally need to slow down and take your time in your relationships. To quote Dr. Covey, with people, fast is slow. Slow is fast. So knowing when to be efficient and when to be effective is probably the most profound takeaway of the 15 years nearly I worked with Dr. Covey.
Wow. What an awesome, awesome lesson. And like an excellent precursor, I think, into our topic today too, Scott. I think you've done this before, right? This isn't your first time here. You're just leading me right into these questions. So
don't expose me, man.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm excited to jump in today. So our topic today is you've pitched us on 3 tips to go from a marketing mess to brand success.
Yeah.
And based on this background and experience and the content in some of your books, I'm excited to dive into this today. But before we do, help us understand this concept that's kind of laid out in the title. So when you talk about messy marketing, what does that really mean? And what are the challenges that marketers face today that might cause this?
Well, so the whole premise, of course, is moving from mess to success, right? I've authored a series of books in the mess to success title. The first book was Management Mess to Leadership Success. That book debuted last year, #1 for 6 weeks solid on Amazon. This new book coming out this year is called Marketing Mess to Brand Success. I'll author a few more. The third one will be Job Mess to Career Success, Communication Mess, Parenting Mess, Sales Mess. This idea is, as leaders, when you own your mess, you make it safe for others to own theirs, right? Everyone's got a mess going on, whether you're a formal leader, informal, whatever your role is. We've all got messes in life. People are talking about them. So why not just own them and learn from them? Doesn't license bad behavior. Doesn't mean you wallow in your messes. It means you're just self-aware, right? That you're vulnerable and that you're willing to own your mess and move to success. So this title is called Marketing Mess to Brand Success. It basically is 30 challenges that every organization and individual understands they're going to face in their careers. Thinking like, how do you make sure you're using the language of your customers, not your own internal language? Because every organization has thick languages, right? How do you make sure that you're always staying on the business development side, that you're close to the cash? I think too often marketers are creative types like me, and we tend to want to do the things that we love. So if we love digital, we do digital. If we love print, we do print. If we love billboards or stunts, we do billboards or stunts. And great marketers don't do what they love. They do what fits the product and service well and messages well to the client. So I looked at 30 messes either I found myself in or saw other brands in, and talk about how to avoid those as we marketers help to build our brands and really serve our customers. I think it just starts with an awareness that we all have messes, and the more vulnerable that we are about them, the more we learn from them and can teach others to avoid them.
Love it. Yeah, that makes so much sense. I'm really excited to dive into your book. When I knew you're coming on here, I ordered it. So it should be here in the next few days. I know which book I'm reading next. So
thank you.
Sounds like awesome stuff. So you talked about the mess that a lot of marketers face. What about the success? What does that look like?
Yeah, it looks like raving fans, right? It looks like customers that refer your products. I once was at a conference, Garrett, a chief marketing officer conference, and one of the speakers, it was a lady, I forgot which brand that she was representing. She said, really, the CMO is the CRO. And when she said CRO, she didn't mean chief revenue officer, but I love that idea. The CEO of our company often would confuse me as being the EVP of sales. So I was the CMO, but I was so tied to revenue generation and closing the gap as a public company that he kind of confused me as the CRO, chief revenue officer. But what she meant when she said CRO was the chief recruitment officer. I think a chief marketing officer's job is to make sure that your employees are proud of your brand, that your employees are passionate evangelizers. They're using their brand. They're proud to work there. They're proud to associate their name on LinkedIn with your brand. So as any role in marketing should be focused on, most amongst all of them should be, are your employers proud to talk about their company? Are they proud to be associated with your brand? Are you building the culture? Are you building a brand? Are you building raving clients where your employees are proud to put on a shirt that has your brand on it? That, I think, is the ultimate test.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think that's something I've talked about on previous episodes with, others about this idea. It ties into really closely to internal marketing. And I think that internal marketing is one of the most overlooked marketing channels that marketers forget about and don't tap into, right?
Can I expand? It's a chapter in my book.
Yeah.
And one of the chapters, I forget the names, is don't forget who your customer is. Your first customer are your employees. Your people who are selling your product are the leaders, right? Because if you don't have their buy-in, if you don't understand the politics of your organization and the culture and how things get done and who has power versus who thinks they have power and who has influence to sink you, right? There are junior accounting executives that can sink you. There are junior financial executives that can sink you. So you got to understand how to build coalitions, how to build a culture of trust, how to make sure that you're listening to your own internal employees so they evangelize for you. Your first customer is absolutely internal, always.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. Yeah. Great. Well, let's get into these tips then. Now that we understand this transition from mess to success, right? these 3 tips that, we're going to talk about today is really like, how do we get there, right? How do we migrate from that mess that we all might be in to a more successful marketing org? So the first tip that we have here is the smallest viable market. I know that this is an idea kind of pulled from Seth Godin, right?
Yeah.
Help us understand this one a little bit more. Smallest viable market.
So my book, Marketing Mess to Brand Success, is not a marketing manual. This is not a book that you learn how to market. It really is, I hope, some sage advice from someone with 30 years in business to understand, what do marketers do? What should they avoid? How should they think? How should they talk? How should they resist certain temptations? It's almost like a career guide in marketing. The best marketing book ever written, in my opinion, is Seth Godin's This Is Marketing. Seth is a good friend of mine. He endorsed my first book, Management Mess. But one of the most important chapters ever authored in the marketing genre is this book that Seth authored called Smallest Viable Market. It's a chapter in his book where he talks about how most marketers want to boil the ocean, right? We're creative, we're gregarious, we're usually charismatic, we have an idea a minute, we're an idea fountain, and we want to boil the ocean. Well, who's your book for? Everyone. Who's your razor for? Everyone. Who's your beer for? Everyone. No, it's not. No. That counterintuitive to those of us like me that have unbridled charisma and think we can sell anything to everyone. No, great marketers understand the opposite, which is not what is your largest viable market. You'll get there if you understand your smallest viable market. Who is the first person that's going to read your blog? Your mom. Who's the second person? Your grandmother. Who's the third person? Your uncle. Who's the fourth person? Your uncle's boss. You get the point, right? Who is the first person who's going to buy your product? What is his name? Where does he work? What does he read? Who is the second person? And it's frustrating, right? It requires a level of discipline and focus and resisting your own temptations to do everything for everyone. And it's something I break myself against every day because I am an idea fountain. I have some creative genius in me, lots of creative genius. I have other areas of my life that aren't genius, right? So I'm not a know-it-all by any stretch. But this idea of really understanding who is the first person and then who is the second person. And every day identify one more person, one more company. You will build a tribe of evangelizing people who feel their product was catered for them versus trying to make sure that you cover everyone and everybody who needs to know about, read about, purchase your product. It's tough. It's a high standard.
Yeah.
But I think Seth is onto something.
Yeah, I love that. I think that that's so true. Seth being the father of modern marketing. And I think many of us have heard it, but it's so hard to get to that point where you can focus enough on that core set of customers. I think back to the first marketing class that I ever took in college. And I remember our professor made us stand up and shout that marketing, or the first rule of marketing, stand for something different that's important, right? And I think that that's key to exactly what you're saying here.
Yeah, well said.
Awesome. Well, tip number 2, more is not better, better is better. Help us understand this one.
Yeah, I think it's grounded in a similar principle, right? Which is, I think naturally, people that go into chemical engineering degrees would probably not consider themselves on the creativity chart that creativity is their passion. Maybe that's not true, right? But they probably would think they are disciplined and left brain and focused. They like systems and controls and logic and order. There's probably some truth to that. My brother is a chemical engineer, so I can pick on chemical engineers. Conversely, I think most marketers will tell you that they like choice and they like volume and they like creativity and they like to debate and argue and wrestle things to the ground. That's probably generally true. It describes me very well as a CMO. And I think as marketers, it becomes our biggest Achilles tendon because there's a seminal book out called Multipliers, written by a friend of mine named Liz Wiseman, right, from Oracle. Liz also endorsed my first book. And in this book, Multipliers, Liz talks about how most of us as leaders are not multipliers of talent, but in fact, we're accidental diminishers. And she identifies 9 diminishing tendencies. One of them is the idea fountain. It's the guy that just has all these ideas like dun, 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 dun. And that was me as a CMO, right? As a public company, we were always trying to hit our quarterly numbers. So I would bring out, my knives, my watches, and the CMO, who's a super smart guy, would be mesmerized by all of my stuff because I'm charismatic and I'm well spoken. I can convince anybody of anything, except for my wife. My point is that this idea fountain that I brought every day turned into my biggest Achilles tendon or heel, because the boss would say, Bob Whitman would say, Scott can get anybody to do anything. And that isn't always a good thing, because I could get anybody to do anything. And so now you have people across the company chasing all 15 of my ideas, right? It's the opposite of Jim Collins' good to great idea of a flywheel. So I think it's important to focus on quality and not quantity. As marketers, we can get bored quick. We're on to the next thing. And I think in the chapter, you'll read about the power of discipline, the power of not opening every conversation with, well, what if we? Because for years, I'd walk into the executive team and said, well, what if we did this? And what if we did that? And all of them made sense. Mm-hmm. And all of them would make some money. The problem was, you had people chasing 15 ideas from Scott Miller versus one really solid idea that everybody got around on for 12 months or 24 months, and it became a $40 million idea.
Yeah.
Not a $400,000 idea.
Love it. Yeah, I think that's so crucial. So follow-up question that I have for you, Scott, is do you have any principles or things to help guide the decision-making process? When should you go broad, and when should you funnel it down and simplify and focus on less but better? You know what I mean? Are there different stages of a company or different times or seasons?
Yes, yes, and yes. I think generally I would say be thoughtful around understanding the difference between tactics and strategy. Mm-hmm. I think too many younger leaders, like myself, rush to tactics. We rush to a solution. We want to fix something with our first idea. And be a little more deliberate about your thought process. Be a little more patient. Really understand the problem. What is the job to be done, right? Mm-hmm. People don't go into the hardware store to buy a drill. They go in because they want a hole. They want to create a hole in the wall or hang a picture, right? You heard this from Clayton Christensen.
Right.
People don't buy a 3-inch drill. They buy a 3-inch hole. You don't buy a nail. You buy the solution of hanging your picture on the wall. So as marketers, I would be thoughtful around not jumping to tactics, not jumping to solutions, but being the last person in the room to speak. Gather all the information, be very clear, and then go back and be thoughtful around which of your 40 ideas is right for this problem. I think generally marketers make a lot of declarative statements. Mm-hmm. I'm guilty of that. Mm-hmm. And that there's great maturity and wisdom with being the E.F. Hutton. For those of you more less seasoned listeners and viewers, one of the best commercials of all time was back in the 70s and 80s of E.F. Hutton, right? This old mm-hmm. white guy that was sitting in a restaurant, and the tagline was, when E.F. Hutton speaks, everybody listens. Mm-hmm. Let that be your brand, that you aren't just, kind of a diuretic of the mouth, that you're not constantly cooking up new ideas. You have those, but you deliberately know when to share them. You'll build remarkable respect about you on the business side.
Love it. Excellent, excellent advice. And that brings us to our third tip. Hire people smarter than you. Tell us a little bit more about this.
Well, I have no experience in this. I just wrote about it. So on this one, I'm a bit of a hypocrite. But let me tell you, again, I'll go back to Liz Wiseman's book, Multipliers. Let's see, I'm 52 now. When I read that book, I was like 48. I was a chief marketing officer in the 7th of my 8-year tenure. And I stepped aside after reading that book. The chairman asked me to stay 3 times. He asked me to stay as the chief marketing officer. But here's what I learned. This is a bit vulnerable, Garrett. I learned that for too many years, I felt like my job was to be the smartest person in the room, the most creative, the most well-read, the hardest working, the genius. And to some extent, that might have been true because as the chief marketing officer, the buck stopped with me, right? A global brand, right? Mm-hmm. Whatever anybody posted on social, what anybody said about in the media, what any of our 70 offices wrote or said about us, right? Was my responsibility. But I think I got a little too much hubris around, no, I'm not the genius in the room. I should be the genius maker of others. So what I think I did subconsciously was I hired people who I could get along with, people that I thought complimented me well, people that would not eclipse me in their skill or talent. As a result, I hired smart people. But I didn't go around the world and hire the best SEO expert or the world's expert at Marketo's marketing automation or Google Analytics. I hired people who were competent enough, but I was fearful that they would eclipse me. People wonder, what is Scott doing? I was insecure. I was self-absorbed. I had imposter syndrome like everyone does. And then I came to realize that no, my job is to hire people who are noticeably more competent marketers than me. And my job is to get them in and make sure they stay and cut through the red tape and have everybody notice all this talent around Miller. Mm-hmm. That's just skunking Miller. My job is not to be the expert on all these things. And then my job isn't then to hold them in marketing. My job is to go a step further and step back and pollinate them over in operations, over in supply chain, over in forecasting, over in the Taipei office, and kind of survey the company-wide landscape of where has all of Scott Miller's genius been pollinated across the company so that they don't just stay for 3 years. They stay for 6 years, 12 years, because they can build a career inside the company, not leave and have to spin out. That right there was a PhD in how to be a CMO. That took me 25 years. And I hope your listeners and viewers take that to heart. If you are the leader of marketing, if you're the leader of any division, it is incumbent upon you to recruit and retain talent that is noticeably, palpably better at what they do than you, and do not feel insecure. Learn from it. At the end of the day, the buck probably stops with you, right? You are the leader, so you have to agree with it or learn from it or sign off on it. But that's a big lesson that I learned, is not to be the smartest person in the room. To quote Liz Wiseman, don't be the genius, become the genius maker of others.
I love that. I think that's such wise advice. I've had, in my career, I've started to learn that lesson. I've had that conversation with many, many people. And I think that, by doing that, that's really how you can multiply your impact and your efforts, right? Yeah. And so such great
it's common knowledge, right? It's not common practice. And I'm trying to do that more in my new career. I did it less as the chief marketing officer.
Yeah, love that. I appreciate the moment of vulnerability there too, because I think we can all resonate and learn from that. So
there's lots of those in the book, right? I mean, 30 messes. You're going to get lots of that in my book.
That's great. Well, I can't wait to get it and dive in a little bit further. Scott, this has been an awesome discussion. As we kind of wrap up here today, I want to ask you a question that's not really related to our topic at all.
Yeah.
What's a commonly held belief in marketing that you just passionately disagree with?
I think that marketing owns sales. I think that marketing too often gets absorbed into brand and brand equity and impressions. And that's not like an industry-wide insult. I think we get too insular. Well, last time I checked, you can't write a payroll check against brand equity. Mm-hmm. Now, I get it. I get the value of brand equity. I was the CMO of a public company for 8 years. But at the end of the day, marketing needs to also be right there, lockstep with sales, owning the revenue results. No finger pointing. Well, if you just did this, no. No marketing campaign should ever be launched if the EVP of sales isn't right there and she believes it and you own it together, right? There's no finger pointing. The biggest cancer in every organization, next to gossip. Gossip is the number one cancer in every company. The second biggest cancer is this ongoing finger pointing between sales and marketing. I don't tolerate that. I was the CMO. The EVP of sales and I were peers. We were peers. But I actually designed our culture in marketing where we served him. And I had to put my ego aside because I could have done his job and he could have done my job, but it was bigger than me. And that marketing served sales. And I think I earned the respect of him and the CEO by making sure that marketing owned the revenue number just as much as sales did. We didn't hide behind brand. We didn't hide behind, well, if only they hired competent salespeople, or none of that. There's no language, right? If we win because we won. If we lose because we lost. And I think that's a culture that every marketing leader has to inculcate in their team. The two best friends in a firm have to be the owner of sales and the owner of marketing.
Yeah, love it. Wise advice. I had a post just this morning on LinkedIn about this topic of, the feud between marketing and sales. Love it. So thank you again for taking the time. Really appreciate it. Scott, as we wrap up here today, if our listeners have other questions or want to get in contact with you or learn more about your books, what's the best resource for them to do that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Social media, I'd love to have you connect with me or follow me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I post all my interviews there in columns. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, mainly LinkedIn. You also can visit franklincovey.com. And you can subscribe to our podcast, On Leadership with Scott Miller, like yours, big interviews every week, bigger than me, certainly. But thanks for asking, Garrett. I appreciate the platform.
Scott, this has been excellent. Really, really appreciate you taking the time today. Hope you have a great rest of the day.
You too, man. Thanks.
Talk to you later. Bye.